Today we will do a Christmas verse using watercolor. I have here some examples of verses that I have already done using Sharpie and watercolor. For this project, I'm using watercolor paper, and I have printed off a verse from my computer. I sometimes will just type it out on a program like Microsoft Word or Google Drive, Google Docs, and then you can play around with the font to make it pretty. You can play around with using different fonts in the same verse. And then I print it off on my computer. Now I am using my pencil and I am coloring on the back of the verse. This is a method that you can use to transfer an image or writing, in this case, to another piece of paper. You can also use a light board or window. I'm going to place my verse in the place that I want it on the paper. It's not always right in the middle. Sometimes I like to do it off to the side a little bit or in the corner in case I want to add extra stuff around it and that side. Sometimes it helps to tape it down as well so it doesn't move, but I'm just going to hold it with my other hand and I'm going to push kind of hard as I trace over my letters. Now, if some of my letters are fatter than others, I do not color in like all of the width of each letter. I can always add the fatter letters with a thicker marker later. So I'm just tracing a single line over each of these letters. And I do have some wider ones and some thinner ones. I'm putting down some good pressure with my pencil to make sure that I get a good transfer to my watercolor paper. Now the watercolor paper I am using for this, I believe, is a 140-pound watercolor paper. It is just the basic brand, I believe, from Hobby Lobby, the Master's Touch brand. You could try it on 90-pound watercolor paper, but it might curl or wrinkle a little bit more. I am trying to take my time to make my letters nice and neat as I am tracing over each of them. Now, at any point, if I am going too fast for you in this video, please feel free to pause so that you can catch up with me. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward. Now I have all of my letters in pencil transferred. It's very light, as you can see. And now I'm going to go ahead over all of my pencil lines with Sharpie. So here I'm showing you the thicker lines. I can use a thicker Sharpie so that they look a little bit wider. And then the thinner lines, I can use the smaller Sharpie so that they look a little bit skinnier. If all of your lines are the same, though, it's not a big deal to just use the same Sharpie the entire time. So you can kind of decide on the width, and you can add more width to your lines if needed. I'm trying to look for all of the areas where I have thick Sharpie first. And I'm doing those, tracing them nice and neatly. And then after I have done all of the thick letters, I'm going to go ahead and do all of the thin letters. I'm going to go ahead and finish up my writing, and as I do that, I'm starting to think about what I'm going to use to add decoration around my letters. So usually I add some type of floral or natural elements, and I wanted to show you some examples of ones first before I dive into this one. So you can see the poinsettia and the leaves here, the berries and the holly. Again, berries and holly leaves and pine cones. This one actually has an angel with some different greens. This one, pine cones and mostly greens with a couple of berries. So I'm going to start off with my focal point, and in this case I'm going to do a red flower. You could do something like a poinsettia if you want. I'm going to do just kind of a nice big red flower, and I'm choosing where I want the focal point to be. So for me it's going to be in the corner. If you don't want a big red flower, you could do a cluster of berries, or you could do a pine cone or something like that. But I'm going to go ahead and start with this. I'm using a nice bright red watercolor paint, and I am kind of picking an area that has extra room. My words are a little bit off to the right, so I'm adding this to the bottom left since there's an extra large space in that area. And I'm starting off with some smaller petals, and then I'm kind of going in and making them a little bit bigger and wider to fill up this space with my red paint. I can always add another layer of red to this flower after this dries. So I may be touching it again, especially with a darker red towards the center parts of the flower. Next, I'm going to add a couple other areas of red. These could be some smaller flowers that look just like the one that I did, or sometimes I like to make flowers going in different directions. So this looks like maybe a smaller flower that's pointing up. Maybe I'll even do just some buds that are kind of coming off to the side here. They haven't quite opened yet. And this kind of spreads the red around my picture. You could also do this with clusters of berries or with pine cones as well. I'm washing my brush, and now I'm going to switch to a green. And I usually like to start off with a really light green, a light color. If you only have one green, then I recommend adding a lot of water with it so that it's just a really light, bright color. You could mix a little bit of yellow with it too. And I'm starting off by adding a stem that kind of curves around my letters, and then I put some nice long thin leaves on either side of the stem. And this just kind of fills in around my words and kind of gets me started with my greenery. I'm going to go ahead and do that on the other side too. Usually my stems have a slight curve to them, kind of like a wreath would, so it kind of goes around with a slight curve. I like to keep it pretty watery so that it's very light. The more water you have with watercolor paints, the lighter it will paint. I'm going to fill this stem with some leaves on both sides as well. I like to kind of make them a little bit large so that they fill up the space with the lighter colors, and then I'll be layering darker colors on top. I'm going to go ahead and add some more down here as well, following the same steps. Now, when I do any type of greenery or organic shapes around words, I usually try to follow these rules. I like to have colors, values that are light and medium and dark. So this would be a light value, the red would be kind of a medium value, and then I'd also like to have some dark values as well. And then I also like to have some large shapes, some medium shapes, and some small shapes. So the big flower is a nice large shape. These leaves are pretty large too. The other two flowers or three flowers are smaller or medium size. So they're kind of in the medium range. And I will also add some small shapes, usually towards the end with like little berries or just real little leaves that can kind of fill in some of the leftover spaces. So as you're working on yours, try to keep that in mind. Dark, medium, and light values and large, medium, and small shapes to fill in your space around your words. Now you can see that I've got a lot of this nice light green going on. I've added it kind of throughout the area that I'm wanting my greens. Now I'm going to go ahead and move to more of a medium value of green. And I'm still working in a larger scale because I tend to work large to small. And I'm going to make some larger leaves that kind of go from my center flower out towards the edges of the paper. So they don't even have to touch necessarily, as long as they're just kind of in the area. People will understand that they're connected to the flower. So usually I like to go between two petals and add a nice large leaf coming out. And then sometimes I'll add a couple other ones that are kind of floating here and there throughout the outside edges of my wreath type shape here. Now this green is still kind of a warm green, so it has some kind of yellow tones to it as well, but I'm not using as much water so that it's giving me a medium value. All right, now I'm going to switch tones here and I'm going to go for a brown. A lot of the times I like to add kind of a stick-like natural element to my greenery, kind of to make it look like some branches or some small twigs. So usually I use kind of crooked lines for this, and then they kind of fill in spaces between the leaves. So I'm just kind of looking for openings right now, and I can have them go behind or in front of some of the greenery that I already have. And it's just going to kind of reach out and fill in some of that space. So I'm just using a brown, not a ton of water, but I don't want it to be super, super dark yet either. I'm still kind of working light to dark with the greenery, especially going around my picture. All right, I need a darker green now, so I'm using a little bit of blue with my green, and I want to start kind of adding some darker values with my greenery. And I figured little pine branches would be a great way to do that. So when I make a pine branch with needles, I start with a straight line, and then I make diagonal lines that come away from that original line. And I'm using a little bit of blue to darken my green. If you want to go even darker yet, you could even add a little bit of purple to your green, and that can give you a darker color for pine. And the pine is a really nice filler, so I'm just going to go around and look for areas that still are not very full. And this is also where I can start kind of overlapping things. So even though I've got these light things going on here, the pine overlaps it without any problems because it's a darker value. So I usually start with the center line, and then again just add those diagonal lines away from it. And you can see by using a round brush that has a really nice point, it's not too hard to get those nice thin brush strokes. I just have to use the tip of my brush and not push down too hard, and I can get some really nice thin pieces of pine needles that are going around my painting here. Again, I'm always working diagonally away from the center till I reach the top. And pine needles are kind of nice because they come in all different shapes and sizes. So you can have super short pine needles, or you could have super long pine needles, and they are all believable, right? There's a lot of different kinds of pine trees, so it's not too hard to have a bunch of different types of pine. All right, the next thing I wanted to add are holly leaves. And I found that one of my favorite ways to do these is to draw the leaf first and then just kind of leave it before I fill it in. I'm gonna let it dry a little bit, and that will kind of keep that nice strong like line shape, line outline on these leaves. So I just kind of make 2 bumps over a center line and 2 bumps under a center line, and I have that kind of holly leaf shape. So again, I'm overlapping some of my lighter things, and I'm using these to kind of fill in where I've got lots of open space still around my plants. I'm going to keep on adding them along the outside edges. Sometimes I do them in clusters of like 2. Sometimes I just have them on their own. They can be large or small. You can just kind of see what fits your space. Now notice too that right now I don't have anything on the top like right corner of my picture, and I think I'm gonna kind of leave that area open and airy, but you don't have to. You can go all the way around and fill the entire area around your words, and that works just fine too. All right, I still have my little brown branches there, and now I'm using brown to add some little dots that are kind of hanging off my branches. I like to do this to give some extra texture to a painting. So all of my textures right now are, well, I've got the pine needles and I've got leaves, but adding these little dots just kind of adds another element to my painting that I like to add sometimes just to give it something different, and adding that brown among all of the greens kind of helps break them up a little bit too. I'm also using this as a time to add a little bit extra brown to the outside edges, maybe a couple extra little branches, fill in a little bit of my top corner, but I still want to have some open areas there too. I'm just adding these little dots to my brown. So at this point, I've done a couple different leaves, I've done my brown, I've done my flowers, and I still feel like it's not quite full enough. It definitely doesn't have a really full feel. So I'm trying to think of other things that I can do to kind of fill in some of that space to make it feel more full. So I'm going to try to mix a very, very dark green. I want to go for my darkest darks now. And I mixed some red with my green. Red and green are opposites on the color wheel. They're complementary colors. And so by adding some red to my green, it can darken it quite a bit. You could also add purple to green and have a similar effect. I am also getting down to some of my smaller details. So I wanted some small leaves because I already have some big and some medium-sized leaves. So I'm making these little branches with some real little leaves coming off of them, and then filling in some nice dark darks to get my darkest values going on in this painting. So I have light lights, I have a medium tone, and now I'm getting my really dark tones in as well. So I'm really trying to have all 3 tones and all 3 sizes of elements in this painting to make it a success. I still have some areas that seem kind of empty, so by filling in with some of these little dark branches, that definitely kind of makes them more full, and it makes them work a lot better. All right, my holly leaves have dried now, so I can go ahead and fill them in with some green, and you'll see that the lines stay where they are so that it still has kind of a nice outline for the leaf shape. So that is what I was looking for. And I'm happy that it's not moving at all. So you do have to wait for it to dry before you go in and fill them in with color. All right, now I'm going to start adding some berries. Berries is one of my favorite ways to add little pops of colors towards the end of a painting. So I am just using some red, and sometimes I do a single berry all by itself just to fill in some of the spaces, or sometimes I do little clusters of 3 berries, usually max. Sometimes I'll do 5 or 6 if I don't have a lot of flowers in my picture. And I just like to kind of spread them around, looking for any holes or areas that are still really light or they still need a little bit of something to kind of fill them in. So I'm kind of randomly spreading these berries out. Notice right now they are just floating in space. They are not connected to anything necessarily, and that's not a big deal. I can always add little stems or just leave them as floating berries and people will get the idea. At this point, I'm also going to darken the center part of the flower just by going over it again with some red. If you need to darken your red, you can add just a hint of green to it and that will darken it as well. I'm also going to darken the bottom of some of these buds here and the bottom of this flower as well, just to give it an extra value. Then I'm going to use a dark, maybe even black, to add some dots to the center of my flower here and maybe the bottom of these flowers just to give it an extra value to make it super nice and dark. And then I can just use a little bit of green to draw some little lines kind of towards the berries to make them look like they're connected to something. Again, you can just leave them as floating berries too if you don't want to have little lines that are connecting them to things. But sometimes they'll just draw little lines that look like they're at least going towards the berries. They're not even touching them necessarily, but they kind of make it look like they're connected to something. I'm going in again with my red and my green to make a really nice dark rich color. And at this point I just want to add some veins to my leaves that are larger. So I've got these nice large leaves that are coming from my flower, and then I sprinkled a couple places around the rest of my painting so I can add little lines or veins to some of these. Sometimes I don't do every single leaf, I don't get super detailed, but just a little bit goes a long ways. Thank you so much for doing this tutorial with me. I hope you enjoyed watching the process of doing verse art. Please visit my channel, Elke Art, for more fun watercolor tutorials and more. Thanks, guys.